Good evening, and welcome to the Getty Center. My name is Peter Tchaikovsky, and I help organize the lecture program here at the museum. And we're glad that you found some time this holiday season to stop in for some intellectual stimulation, and hope we'll see you again. Our next lecture is a week from Sunday, and as you saw on the rotating screen, Peter Scottborn from Amsterdam will be here to kick off our Rembrandt exhibition, which opens next week. Rembrandt and His Pupils Telling the Difference is the name of his lecture. That lecture and all programs here at the Getty are always listed on the website getty.edu. The occasion for, or the opportunity for tonight's program are our current photographs exhibitions. I know many of you got to see them earlier this evening, but if you haven't already, you still have some time to visit sometime before the exhibitions end, not tonight. Irving Penn's Small Trades exhibition, an example of which is on the screen, curated by Virginia Heckert and Anne Lacoste. And it's accompanied by an In Focus exhibition. This is our series of exhibitions which highlight the deep collections of photography here at the Getty Museum and pick a subject or an approach to photography and illustrate it throughout the history of the medium. So the current exhibition focuses on images of workers, including this one by Lewis Hine and this one by Walker Evans. And both of those exhibitions are open into 2010. One of the little-known facts about J. Paul Getty's extraordinary bequest to this institution was that he did not designate his funds for the study of art history, but rather for the very simple and broad purpose of the advancement of artistic and general knowledge. Our Getty Perspectives lecture series explores the relationship between artistic and general knowledge by periodically bringing speakers and scholars from a variety of disciplines to explore this, what an art museum can teach us about general knowledge. As you saw on screen, and I'll just mention our next Getty Perspectives lecture that is scheduled won't be until May, but it'll bring the author Jeff Dyer here to the Getty Museum. And many of you may not have read Jeff Dyer, but he's quite a gifted writer who works in both fiction and nonfiction and is generally classified as a writer who's unclassifiable. So I highly recommend that you mark that on your calendars and come back. Some of his titles include Yoga for People Who Can't Be Bothered and Jeff in Venice, neither of which are what they might seem from their title. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Richard Sennett to the Getty Museum. Richard Sennett is someone who I think embodies in many ways this idea of the advancement of artistic and general knowledge. In his rich body of work, which I won't recapitulate now, he brings in many ways an artist's sensibility. Having been a cellist for most of his life, he frequently draws on the art of music to inform the way he thinks about sociological problems. And he's also a person in the social sciences who very frequently relies on and explores artistic creation as something that can help him understand the problems that he's set forth in his own work. His latest book, The Craftsman, obviously as the title indicates, is one such example where he uses the accomplishments of artists to help him understand broad sociological issues. And he just told me that the book was awarded just 2 days ago the Spinoza Prize. He's changed the title of his talk tonight, so if you came to hear about an old unhappy marriage, you're going to instead hear about simply craftsmanship. Please welcome Richard Sennett.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to read for about 45 minutes, and then Maybe we can talk, I mean, it's a very grand hall, but we can maybe talk informally for 15 minutes after that, and I gather there are people with roving mics who can help us do that. I changed the title of my talk because I'm really sort of seduced and interested in the exhibition that's here, and it's a fantastic exhibition, and I urge you, if you haven't, to go see it. The photographs that make up small trades, Penn shot in 1950 and 1951 in Paris, London, and New York. And these are really landmark images in photography. But I'm going to speak this evening about their subjects rather than about Penn's art. The people who figure in small trades are artisans, craftsmen of all sorts, from waiters to welders to window washers. And I want to explore with you tonight 3 issues. First, the sort of political aura that surrounds craftsmen. And second, I want to say a little about the nature of craftsmanship. This is kind of précis of my book. And I'm not sure it's clear, but you'll tell me. And finally, I thought it would be interesting for us to think about in what ways the people that we see involved in these small trades might hold up a mirror to ourselves. Do we recognize anything about ourselves in these craftsmen? Now, all of these are big subjects, and my aim is only to raise in your mind some questions about what you see on the walls of this exhibition. Let me say something first about the political image of the craftsman. Because the people in these photographs are subjects loaded with political value. These artisans are the sort of workers which modern capitalism appears to have doomed. Their trades replaced by industrial machines, or if they're service workers, by voice answering and other computerized technologies. The artisan worker figures as kind of victim in social thought. This is true from the time of Adam Smith on. Yet Penn's subjects look nothing like victims. They tell another story. And we could start this story in 1751, when Denis Diderot and a raft of collaborators began publishing the Encyclopedia of Arts and Crafts, which was a vast enterprise of many volumes whose publications spread over 20 years. Diderot enlisted a diverse band of writers and engravers in Paris, few whom he paid, most of whom squabbled with each other and with him, but with a single aim in mind, to affirm and explain the dignity of craft labor. Small trades involved, Diderot asserted, real skills which polite society has ignored or scorned as menial. That scorn has an ancient root in attitudes the Romans first harbored about the work of their slaves and their plebs. But to the editor-writer of the 18th century, this ancient attitude ill-served society. Diderot's affirmation of the dignity of all labor had a sharp point. He took advantage, and this is a very amusing thing, of the alphabetical format of a dictionary, for instance, to make that sharp point. He put the article on rôtisseur, that's roaster of meat, near to the article on roi, which is king. Now, both had their own trades. Each was skillful. And in that sense, Diderot wanted to make his readers feel they stood on something of an equal footing. And that political point about the dignity of labor, of artisan labor, was taken up by many of the encyclopedia's readers. American readers, like Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, concluded that the craftsman made the ideal citizen of a republic due to the worker's self-discipline, cooperation with others in the shop, and quality-mindedness about results. The craftsman, rather than the gentleman, living off the labor of others, seemed to be the sensible citizen. Now, the Enlightenment's ideal craftsman had another side. The encyclopedia evoked the sheer pleasure in the practice of craft, an evocation which connects the 18th century images directly to Irving Penn's photographs. Pleasure? Diderot's roasters and weavers, like Penn's subjects, convey something other, something deeper than kitsch smiley happiness. They appear serene. That's the overwhelming feeling you have in looking at these people. Both groups, from the past and what you see on the walls here, we'd say are inside their work. They evince a kind of quiet pride in what they do. In that 18th century, this inner serenity appealed to readers of the encyclopedia like Catherine the Great in Russia, much as she might dispute the equation of Haute-Serre and Roy. This calm side of craftsmanship matters to us too, because both the past and present images depict a state of inner well-being which is acquired by the acquisition and practice of skill. That is, that a certain kind of selfhood is formed by being good at doing something. And that's it. And the kind of selfhood is expressed in this quiet serenity. Now, that's a story that has a peculiar politics, because there's another story which is a kind of victim story, which is about artisans who are deprived of skill and so deprived of well-being in the course of capitalist development. The artisan is reduced to an animal pair of hands, or in the modern social imaginary, he or she confronts the specter of uselessness because automation has no need of human workers. Now, this victim story is not false. It's often how we think about artisans, They're doomed, as I said before. But it's incomplete. New crafts are being created all the time, for instance. Had Penn chosen to take people from hospitals or scientific laboratories, he could have showed us a whole new host of modern small trades. The victim story also forces the worker into a mold, because the most important fact about work becomes oppression. To regain well-being, the oppressed must revolt. This is, for instance, Delacroix's worker in the great painting of the 1830 Revolution, Liberty Leading the People. Most of you must have seen this. This ragged band of people led by this half-naked allegorical figure of liberty. These are people who are suffering, who want to break their chains. That's fine, but the victim story lays upon the worker the burden of being an avatar of radical social change, of making it happen for everyone else. Getting on with one's life as best one can is not included within its frame. Now, perhaps Penn does not show us the victim story because he took artisans out of their ordinary setting and placed them in makeshift studios against nondescript backgrounds. His workers brought their tools of the trade to the studio, as you'll see in the exhibit, but neither their bosses nor their co-workers. If Penn is an imagist whose politics belong to the Enlightenment, so too it should be said, is this true of his nearer sources, Auguste Zander and Eugène Auger. Both the German Zander and the French Auger had eschewed the aesthetic of the suffering worker. Both had emphasized the dignity of even the smallest trades. Those Zander's art, and you can see one wonderful example of that, of Zander in this show, only one, I may add. Though Sander's art is largely place-bound to Köln and to his hometown of Westerwald, his people spring out as presences independent from place, as do I judge Auger's photographs of workers in the streets of Paris. Sander, Auger, and Penn show us people either resting from, interrupted in, or simply AWOL from their jobs. And for all three, skill has become the aura, the halo of individual character. So that's the kind of politics that's in these photographs. It's a politics emphasizing the dignity of work rather than the oppression of workers. If you're engaged in the history of photography, you will know that there's another way of photographing work, which again does not resort to the victim's story. It appears in the images of Francis Johnson, who at the end of the 19th century went to the Hampton Institute in Virginia to photograph the craft workshops for ex-slaves and also for displaced Native Americans after the Civil War. This was the Hampton Institute, like Tuskegee Institute, was set up by Booker T. Washington. Her photographs show us people actually doing work and doing it together. It's work of a more agricultural character than we see in Penn's work, for instance, cheese making and greenhouse management. Johnson's images show what work could look like once the worker is free. It's again a politics. She highlights the industry and orderliness of ex-slaves in the Hampton Institute, an emphasis meant to counter the racist view of African Americans as slovenly and chaotic once freed from the master's whip. But still, the human visages in these photographs resemble the faces of Auger or Penn's urbanites. They too are serene and calm. So we might wonder, what is it about craftsmanship that can produce this inner strength? To put it another way, what's the human connection between Penn's artisans who practice such different small trades? What produces this inner strength? And in the second and major part of this talk, I want to give you the answer that I understand about why craftsmen look like this, these people on the walls. Let's explore the question of craftsmanship in two ways. First, by accounting the self-confidence so visible in Penn's photographs, and then by bringing to light the cooperation between workers, which is invisible in these photographs because we don't see people actually working with each other. Skilled confidence plus skilled cooperation add up to that quality which I call craftsmanship. The self-confidence bred into skilled workers is a matter of time. This is the most important thing I have to say to you. Craft work is slow and it's long. One measure of the time it takes to become skilled in the practice of a craft is the so-called 10,000-hour rule. This rough number translates into practicing 3 or 4 hours a day for 5 to 7 years. The time needed to gain mastery, whether one is learning piano technique, glass blowing, a sport, or surgery. What happens during those 10,000 hours? In my view, 3 things happen. First, in practicing, one repeats an action again and again until it comes out right. In my own craft of music, for instance, the student goes over scales again and again until the tones of the cello sound exactly in tune, and the shifting between notes becomes seamless. You're actually going from positions, but you don't feel that. It takes years to be able to do that. Getting something right the first time you do it is not really skillful. Just because you may not be able to do so the second or the 10th time, You really need to ingrain facility into your body so that it is a habit on which you can rely. But repetition of this sort can't become a static activity. The musician practicing scales will only gradually lighten finger pressure, develop more flexible action at the knuckle ridge. The body is, after all, learning an unusual habit, and you develop such habits slowly. Ingraining habit, moreover, requires a musician or any other craftsman to remain alert even while doing the most routine things week after week, month after month, like playing scales. Going over something again, practicing how to do it, our behavior has to evolve in the course of those 10,000 hours. And to put this abstractly, it's through practicing, through slow time, that our bodies metamorphosize into skill. And puts quite simply, this is how we improve. Now, this is self-evident in playing the cello or playing golf. But what about photography, which to the outsider can seem now to require much less physical technique and much less time? I was interested in the answer the photographer Thomas Strutt gave to me when I raised this issue with him. A man who clicks the shutter rarely during a photo shoot. Strutt obliges his students to click a lot, much more than necessary, and to vary their own postures in holding the camera. Similarly, he obliges his students to work in the darkroom with the same variety of effort, or with printing the same image on different papers with different chemicals. Instant photography, so easy with today's digital cameras, means, Strutt says, the photographer does not learn how to approve. So the 10,000-hour rule, in practice, in principle, if not in actual number, it still applies. By forcing them to slow down, Strutt teaches his students bodily habits of posture and sensitizes them to materials. In the darkroom, he says the photographer learns how to coordinate the eye with the nose as well as with touch. And this is the phenomenon we call embodiment. That is, we're embodying the thing in ourselves. And that's what happens in slow time, is embodiment. The second aspect of craft skill follows directly from the first. From learning to do one thing well, there can emerge many different alternative ways to a goal. This is the, and I quote, more than one way to skin a cat rule. One of my students, a skilled glassblower, describes the sense of mastery which came to her in manipulating the blowpipe when she found several alternative ways to hold the pipe, always with the same goal of keeping the blob of molten glass rounded at the tip. The habits we learn in long, slow time of craft work become tacit understandings, that is unconscious, when embodiment is a way of producing a kind of unconsciousness in us, which means we don't have to think consciously about what we're doing it when we do it. I will now raise my knuckle in order to play B flat perfectly. We don't have to go through that. But the cat rule, if I can shorten it, applies to a more conscious movement of thinking there is another way to do this, then pursuing the possibility, then ingraining it once again as habit through repetition. So these two rules lie to each other as the relationship between consciousness and then what's called tacit behavior or learned unconsciousness. Developing a repertoire of multiple solutions serving the same end is important because in the artisan's realm, raw materials can vary, and even more because the circumstances of practice vary. A football player put into a new team may have to change his or ways of playing, of throwing or kicking, to adapt. In musical work, the physical temperature of different halls or the emotional temperature of different conductors oblige us to achieve the same goal by different means. Above all, the cat rule builds up confidence. The craftsman is confident that he or she can meet the challenges of different circumstances because he or she has developed a repertoire of techniques rather than is reliant on just one way of doing things. So that's the first two elements that create in the way in which skill creates this psychological condition of confidence. The third element of craft confidence is perhaps less obvious than the 10,000 hour or the cat rules, but it's of equal value. There is, in learning a skill, an intimate connection between problem solving and problem finding. Once we know how to make something work, we then want to know what are its implications, what it leads to. The difficulty is that these implications are not immediately clear. I'll give you an example. For instance, in the 16th century, new ways of mixing metals and tempering them produced the first truly sharp steel knives and scissors. But the butchers and barbers who bought them didn't know quite what to do with these improved tools. It took about 60 years for barbers, who frequently doubled as surgeons, to learn. It must have been a horror to learn in the 16th century, imagine. Cut your hair, cut your neck, I don't know. It took about 60 years for barbers, who frequently doubled as surgeons, to learn new knife techniques. In the history of technology, this is pretty common. A tool appears before people know how to use it. Another version of the intimate connection between problem solving and problem finding is the pregnant wrong answer. That is, the answer which proves more productive, opening up new terrain, than the quick right answer. An example here comes from weaving. The jacquard loom was initially developed by weavers in Lyon, threading their looms the wrong way. It's a pregnant mistake which, after it was pondered and studied, created a whole new craft. I want to just add something to the text in this regard. If you buy my book, which is wonderfully cheap, and I'll even sign a copy for you, you'll see that I am very against multiple choice tests in learning with anything that has to do with skill development. And you know, if you're youngsters, you know the reason for this. You have to take a test as many right answers as possible. So you've got to, go superficially through and answer as knowledge whatever you can immediately do to get the most numbers. This means you can't dwell in all the possibilities of a wrong mistake. In mathematics, in music, in glass blowing, in weaving, it's often doing something wrong which is stimulating. And we have a whole educational regime for teaching craft, and I think also teaching art, which disables people from exploring the beauty and the pregnancy of the wrong answer. So that's why I insist on this. And it's a way of de-skilling students by forcing them to only care about getting the right answer rather than understanding the pregnant wrong answer. Now, what lies behind this? The intimate, ambiguous relation between problem solving and finding enables curiosity. No skill develops without a good dose of curiosity, which enables us to think what might be rather than what is. Like the barbers, or again, to become self-critical, like the weavers. Irving Penn in The Dark Room offers a good example of both. The images of small trades, when first printed, seemed to him to contain unrealized possibilities. In later decades, he he experimented with gelatin silver and platinum palladium prints made from these negatives. In this, he, like any good craftsman, had understood the resonance of the word mastery. Mastery of a medium is not a static condition. As Matisse observed in 1815, when he was struggling with the possibilities of black as a color, others thought he was by then a consummate colorist, but to him, he knew better. His control only opened up new questions. It's true in more prosaic work as well, and one reason why a good measure of anxiety attends a much highly skilled labor. What's next? Now, it might seem odd to join worry of this sort. What's it about? What can I do with it? What's it mean? To self-confidence. Yet in the real world of practice, they do marry. Again, the issue of repetition reappears, and now in a productive form. The master craftsman, be she a potter, nurse, or Stradivarius, does not usually want to do something perfectly just once and then retire to grow roses. She wants to do it again, from which follows what next, what then. Now, I've tried to account in sum 3 elements which create in craftsmanship the sort of calm confidence so visible in Penn's photographs. The embedding of habit over 10,000 hours or so of practice, multiple solutions to the problem of skinning a cat, a proactive join between problem solving and problem finding, a join in which mastery and anxious curiosity combine. These are, in my view, the most important ways we achieve skill and continue to grow once we've got a skill under our belts. Now, I want to end this talk with just saying something about the social side of this labor, which you don't see in these photographs. That is, people actually working. There are indeed a few crafts which can be practiced all alone, but no one I know of has ever learned how to be a potter or a weaver simply by reading a book. Craftsmanship involves hands-on learning. This phrase, hands-on learning, can simply invoke the cliche of learning by doing, but more cogently, it applies a set of social relations, a master, teacher who shows as well as tells the novice what to do, or a master teacher who serves as a coach and critic for the novice's effort. Hands-on learning implies so that there's an inequality in that social relationship. Hands-on learning implies also community of other novices. There is equality, but in this equality, one measures oneself against one's peers, one learns from them, and of course one gossips and complains about the master with them. This social scene, this kind of unequal sociability, shaped the classic medieval workshop, the Renaissance artist's atelier, as it does the modern scientific laboratory. Now, cooperation comes in 2 forms. One is naive and natural, and the other is skilled. As a species, we share with all social animals certain instincts of cooperation, which appear among infants, for instance, in coordinated work with a mother or a nurse's nipple. A little later, in childhood, this naive cooperation appears in play with other kids. Cooperation at later stages of the life cycle depends, of course, much more on cultural circumstances, and it requires a developed skill, which I'm going to describe to you, rather than sheer instinct in order to succeed. The classic craft workshop, like the modern science lab, was a hierarchy, as I've said. Its 3 elements were the master, the journeyman, and the apprentice. In the lab, the professor, the postdoc, and the graduate student. The most interesting figure to me in this hierarchy is the journeyman, and that's the man or woman in the middle, and the one most in need of skilled cooperation. He or she has put in the hours, learned the CAT principle, perhaps as a glimpse of possible ways of working beyond what the master does, and yet still the journeyman is not free. He or she remains dependent. I've observed photographers in this position, and I want to say something that's a little more personal than a formal lecture about this, about how people in the journeyman position deal with that ambiguity and the kind of skilled cooperation they learn to deal with it. Some people at the journeyman stage handle this situation well. For instance, my friend Richard Avedon, who, like Irving Penn, learned from Alexei Brodovich and treated his master with lifelong respect. Both photographers, in turn, had in Alexander Lieberman at Vogue a more ambiguous relationship. Lieberman acting as a demanding master, who, however, lacked their particular craft. A familiar situation to all of us, the boss who's got the power but can't do the work. Although in Lieberman's case, he was a maker of wonderful monumental sculpture. Lieberman was also their patron, and when they were starting out, they frequently needed to appease him, and he needed to be stroked and so on. I'm sorry to give you all these personal details, but just to make this resonate to you about what this journeyman position is like. In the classic craft workshop, the journeyman's status could be somewhat resolved because in time, one of the journeymen would eventually take the master's place. Again, that replacement can occur in a scientific lab. But neither of these photographers wanted to become eventually Alexander Lieberman. I cite this because more largely, hierarchies pose this problem for people in the middle. What to do with their achieved skills? How best to put those skills to use before one is either a boss or independent? Social thought from Condorcet has imagined cooperation via the respectful division of labor. Each person lets the other get on with doing their own thing, and the sum of these individual labors produces a product. Penn shoots the image, Lieberman positions it on the page. But do your own thing is a child's fantasy of cooperation. It assumes that everyone is, as it were, on the same page, desiring the same end, and that everyone is nice. Whereas people are not in complex hierarchies on the same page because they have different interests. They are often intensely competitive, resentful, or jealous, all of which renders them not nice. And the result, therefore, does not add up, particularly for people in the middle of the hierarchy. People can deal in the workshop with this tension, and indeed they have to deal with it practically to get work done. They can do so. The workshop itself can train people how to cooperate as though cooperation were a craft of everyday diplomacy. Back office white-collar workers are in the journeyman position, become good diplomats of cooperation, for instance, when they do not repeat the boss's criticisms of fellow employees, or when they recognize the good work of another employee with a smile rather than fulsome, melodramatic, self-conscious praise. To take again a musical example, when we rehearse a string quartet, we are constantly facing the problem of everyday diplomacy. Mere technical skill isn't going to make us play well together, nor will the solution be found by imposing one's personal vision of the quartet on the other three. And certainly being nice will not produce good music. The secret of good cooperation is a matter of giving signs of recognition and balancing those signs by letting other people do their own thing. It's also a matter of collective problem solving and problem finding. That is, of finding what people need each other to do, why they need each other to get something done. This kind of adult cooperation always takes time to develop. In the non-artistic world, it also requires an office or a factory which is stable enough and function that people get to know one another. The craft workshop embodies the sort of environment in which cooperation can be learned, an environment which is far different from the office or factory in which people shuttle in and out, far different again from the consultant's realm in which superficial pleasantness masks a lack of sustained engagement in other people or their work. And I'm now trying to study more this kind of everyday diplomacy as a form of cooperation in many, many different fields. But it's something, particularly in the writings about Avedon, I don't know how much Penn wrote about his relations with Lieberman, and where he said, I had to learn how to protect myself and give something to Alexander Lieberman. And in the end, I became a diplomat, and I respected myself for learning that art of diplomacy. It's a very complicated problem. To sum up, craftsmanship names two things: the development of skills within an individual and the practices of cooperation itself as a craft, adult in character rather than naive, and modeled on diplomacy. Of course, I'm reading into Penn's images of craftsmen what I know about craftsmen more broadly, and I make no apology for doing so. The images resonate. I'm reading into these images something very specific, and I hope this is what you take away from this lecture, that there is a narrative in craft work. That's what I've tried to describe to you. That is, there are stages of its becoming and unfolding. I'm not going to read you I have much more to say to you, but I've already talked too much. So I'm just going to summarize to you the end of this talk. What's this got to do with us? Do we see in these pictures from half a century ago anything that looks like us? Do they hold up a kind of mirror to us? It's often said, and I just say this to you informally, it's often said about artisanship that it's over, that this is all nostalgia, romantic longing for the pre-industrial era and so on. This is a very, very dangerous thing for us to believe, because it makes us, really puts us out of touch with how we might be able to use the machines of our own time, to treat the machinery we have in our own time as craftsmen rather than simply as consumers. And there are many dimensions of this. We don't think like craftsmen, for instance, when we want user-friendly objects, a computer that we never have to inquire how it works, so that we just run programs somebody else gives to us. We do think like craftsmen when we use computer programs like Linux instead of Microsoft, programs that are open source, where we actually, none of us is going to become computer mavens. Maybe some of you are, but not most of us. But at least we can understand that there's a connection between what we make and what we use. And what I feel about this subject is that the problem, I'll give you another example of this. In the learning process I've described to you, you might think, well, this is all replaced by people learning on, sitting in a computer terminal, learning in that nice, cheap way that screen talks, you don't need to hire a teacher and so on. Enough studies have now been done of this, and again, you can read about these in my book, to know that this kind of learning, on-screen learning, is very slow and very superficial. And the reason is not people, for instance, learn mathematics much more slowly by learning algebra on screen than they do in a traditional classroom. The reason to you by what I've said, that in order to learn something, you've got to dwell in its difficulty. Every time you reduce difficulty, you no longer animate the sense of curiosity. The fault is not these machines, and indeed, the fault is us, that we don't have a craftsman-like attitude about the technologies of our own time. I've been very struck by the fact that I've gotten to know people in the craft and code movement, which are among programmers, which is a movement to get the users of modern technology to do exactly like that, to think about themselves as craftsmen who can participate in this and be intelligent about it. On the social side, there's something called Google Wave, which is now in beta testing, which is trying to use the machines to get people to actually cooperate and talk to each other rather than to do this passive on-screen learning. So what I would say in sum about this is that when I look at these pen photographs, there are crafts that have disappeared, most of them. But that the process of craftsmanship hasn't disappeared. The problem is that we have difficulty seeing our relationship to the technologies and tools of our own time as one of making, of being ourselves craftsmen. So in that sense, I think they're extremely challenging. So this is what I really wanted to say to you about what the thoughts that this exhibition has inspired in me. It contains a politics of a very noble sort, but it hides the kind of narrative, as is inevitable in the still image, the narrative of becoming skilled. And our challenge, I think, today is to engage and unpack that narrative rather than to be merely passive consumers of the tools of our own time. So, thank you very much. Shall we have a couple of minutes of questions? Anything you want to ask me about this, argue with? Yes, this gentleman right here. If somebody gives you a microphone, then you'll be registered in the Getty forever,
yes. Hello.
Eternally.
Hello. I can't speak for the people in this room in terms of their interest in being craftsmen, but it strikes me that the average person in the average situation doesn't know or care about craftsmanship.
Yes.
And so I think are we sitting here talking about something in a bubble, or are we? How do we? 100 years ago, or X number of years ago, maybe 150 years ago, craftsmanship was very important because it took a person to create something that lasted and that functioned. Today, that's not necessary, and so I think the average person doesn't know or care, and I'm wondering how you respond to that.
Well, I think you're saying two different things. One is that people don't think very much about it, which is, I think, quite true. Where I would look at this differently than you, I must say, is that I think, in fact, people are engaged in skilled activities all the time. And they want to be good at those skilled activities. But the way our society is set up and our economy is set up, there isn't much reward, for instance, for doing a good job for its own sake. In fact, I don't want to say anything about bankers or the rich, but we can see that rewards can come for people who are not very, well, you can complete the sentence. And competence is its own reward in some way. So I would say if you said to a nurse, do you really care about your nursing skills? She said, absolutely, and I want to improve them. But if you said to her, do you think that being a nurse has anything to do with being a potter? She or he would have a hard time making that connection. And that's where I think this discourse has to develop. I don't agree that people just do indifferent work, that they don't care about it.
Well, I would just comment that possibly the term craftsmanship is anachronistic in the 21st century. And I say that could be rightly or wrongly, but I think it's a fact. And maybe there's a more of a Google-esque word or a 21st century word that, I'm being facetious, but maybe there's a word.
Yeah, but what would it be?
I don't know. I mean,
what? DIY. Yeah, except, maybe do it yourself. I'm not happy with that either. Let's get another, thank you for that. Will you write me when you come up with this word? I'll change the title of the book, Let's get another question right here. It's the other side. I want to make you work, you need exercise. You've got a microphone.
You talked a lot about the people in front of the camera,
Yeah.
the artisans, the craftsmen. You talked a little bit about the man behind the camera. Who is he? Another artisan and craftsman? Or is he an artist?
Yeah.
And where's the transition?
Yeah. Well, I originally was going to talk to you about that tonight. I'm always disappointing people, it's in the nature of life, I'll give you a 3-minute answer, my answer to that question, and then after that, let's call it an evening. And just stop me if this 3 answers gets to be about 3 or 4 hours answers for this. First of all, I have to say something to as a musician, what I feel is that there obviously is no art without craft, and that the greatest challenge we face as musicians is learning not to have an idea about something, the way something sounds, but actually to have a sound. When somebody starts, I don't know if this is true in art school, but in conservatories, when somebody starts talking about what Brahms means, I want to reach for my metaphorical gun, Now, ours is a very physical art, And I don't mean it's unthinking, but I mean that for the man behind the scene, for the artist, finding a physical embodiment for expression is what we spend all our time about. The photographers I know would make the same argument. Now, you could make it otherwise. You could say that sculptors who don't do their own fabrication can make a different argument, right? But so my first response to you about this is it depends whether you are the author of your own object. And if you are, like any musician or dancer or actor, the author of your own object, it's in technique that you build expression. There is no other beyond that. That's why I just give you an example. When you go to hear Gustavo Dudamel, who's your new conductor here, who's a genius as a conductor, if you can go hear him rehearse, it's a revelation of this. Does he talk about Brahms' intended X? Here we have ironic subversion of the tonic. No, he goes, not so much. Something's wrong. That's how he conducts. And it's that kind of visceral way of doing it which provokes a freedom in the people who rehearse from him. What's this mean? You know, what's going on here? But I would say that that's within the realm of making art, that's a huge divide. Anybody who has to engage in embodiment has to be first and foremost a craftsman. I also feel about this that this question about the relationship between art and craft is embedded in another question, which is not a good one, which is about the role of genius, which is that the craftsman is just your ordinary schlep, you know, the guy who knows how to do it, but that a true artist is exceptional, a genius, you know. And politically, to me, I find that very troubling, because I think, or you know, in most popular arts, it isn't a question of being, you know, the Michelangelo of country music. You know, it's about being expressive, about making it. And I think this is I think it's from a social point of view, very destructive distinction, because it's really about the sort of superiority of the artist, and more, when it's drawn out in the performing arts, about making a divide between subjective feeling, right, the artist's inner vision, all of that kind of nonsense language, and the actual physical result. So that you get a kind of inequality and you get a subjectivity which are privileged over the moment, the event, the happening. And I think this is fatal in expression, you know. When I hear young people, you know, young writers say to me, "I've got such a great idea for a novel. I know it's never going to happen." Do you know what I mean? It's never going to happen. So to me, this should be a non-question. We should forget about the distinction between art and craft and focus on craft. And that's, I guess, how I'd answer you. And with that, let me thank you all for coming, and I'll meet you outside. There might even be drinks outside, is that correct? Something like that, and I'd be glad to sign books.